By noon on the 9th of July, 1755, Edward Braddock could finally see how his campaign was going to end. Fort Duquesne was less than 10 miles away. His cannons were almost there. Then a smaller French and native force appeared in the woods ahead. The British formed. They fired. The French commander fell, and the men behind him began giving ground. For a few minutes, Braddock had exactly the battle he wanted. He was winning. 3 hours later, his army was running back down the same road it had spent weeks building toward victory. More than 900 men were dead or wounded. Braddock was dying. And riding through the wreckage was a 23-year-old Virginia volunteer named George Washington. He had come here hoping the British Army would finally make him one of its officers. That part of the story is important, because a year earlier, Washington's military career had ended about as badly as a military career could begin. He had marched into the Ohio country with Virginia troops, become trapped by the French at a little fort called Fort Necessity, and surrendered in the middle of a rainstorm. The trenches flooded. The powder got wet. The enemy controlled the surrounding woods. Washington had nowhere left to go. Then he came home and discovered that things could somehow get worse. Virginia reorganized its forces in a way that would place provincial officers beneath regular British officers. Washington hated the idea, so he resigned. He was 22 years old. He had lost his first campaign, surrendered his first fort, and walked away from the army. You might think that would have convinced him to find another career. It did not. Washington wanted something very specific. He wanted to become a regular British officer, not a temporary colonial commander, not a militia officer. He wanted the uniform, the rank, and the professional standing that came with serving directly under the crown. Then Edward Braddock arrived in America. And to Washington, Braddock must have looked like a second chance. Braddock had spent almost half a century in the army. Britain had made him commander-in-chief of its forces in North America and sent him west with 2 regular regiments. His orders were simple: go to Fort Duquesne, take it. Finish the job Washington had failed to finish the year before. Washington immediately volunteered for Braddock's staff. He was not preparing to fight Britain. He was trying to impress it, and for a while, Britain gave him plenty to be impressed by. Braddock assembled roughly 2,400 British and colonial troops. There were professional infantrymen, engineers, artillery crews, horses, cattle, ammunition, tools, and hundreds of wagons carrying almost everything an 18th century army might need. Compared with Washington's miserable little expedition the year before, this thing was enormous. Fort Duquesne had another problem. If Braddock could drag all of that artillery to its walls, the French would be facing exactly the kind of battle they did not want: a siege. And Braddock had brought the guns to do it. The only problem was getting them there. There was no proper road through the mountains, so Braddock decided to make one. Every day, men moved ahead of the army with axes and shovels. Trees came down, stumps came out. Streams were bridged. Rough ground was flattened. Then the army moved forward. Then they did it again, and again. The British were literally cutting a road through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne. It was an impressive solution. It was also becoming a nightmare, because every cannon that would make Braddock stronger at the fort made him slower on the road. Every wagon carried something useful. It also had to be dragged over the mountains. More supplies meant a longer column. A longer column meant more road. More road meant more time. The army had brought everything it needed to win. Now it was discovering the price of bringing all of it. Some days they barely moved. Braddock grew frustrated, so he made a decision. He split the expedition. Colonel Thomas Dunbar stayed behind with the slowest troops, the heaviest wagons, and much of the supply train. Braddock took roughly 1,400 men and pushed ahead. Almost immediately, things improved. The army moved faster. The fort got closer. After weeks of crawling through the mountains, Braddock could finally feel the campaign speeding up. And then George Washington nearly missed the whole thing. He came down with dysentery, badly. For days, the young aide was so sick that he had to travel in a wagon. Braddock wanted him to remain behind and recover. Washington refused. He had come west for a reason. If Fort Duquesne was about to fall, he wanted to be beside the man who captured it. So Washington dragged himself back to the advance column. On July 9th, the British crossed the Monongahela River. Then they crossed it again. And suddenly, after weeks of hacking through forest and mountain, the landscape opened up. The army could finally look like the army Washington had wanted to see. Red-coated infantry marched in ordered columns. Flags moved above the ranks. Drums and fifes carried through the trees. Artillery rolled behind them. Fort Duquesne was only a few miles away. Inside the fort, the French understood exactly what those guns meant. If they waited for Braddock to arrive, they might not survive what came next. So they came out to meet him. And this is where the story gets strange, because the Battle of the Monongahela did not begin with some perfectly prepared ambush. The two advance forces more or less ran into each other. The British saw the enemy saw the British, and Braddock's men reacted first. They formed. They fired. Their opening volleys hit hard. The French officer leading the advance was killed. Men behind him began falling back. Imagine what that must have looked like to Washington. For the first time since he entered the Ohio country, the professional army he admired was doing exactly what a professional army was supposed to do. Enemy appears, formation, volley, enemy retreats, simple, and then the enemy stopped playing that kind of battle. French troops, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors spread into the woods. Some moved left, others moved right. They took cover behind trees and uneven ground, and they began shooting back. The British front stopped. Men behind them could not see why. So they kept moving forward. Then the troops at the front began falling backward, and two parts of the same army suddenly started moving in opposite directions on the same narrow route. That was the first crack. Then came another. Companies mixed together. Wagons clogged the road. Artillery horses panicked. Commands disappeared beneath musket fire and smoke. The British could hear shots coming from the trees, but often they could not see the men firing them. A flash on the left, a shot from the right, movement behind a tree. Men fired back at whatever they could see. Virginia troops tried to spread out and use cover, but now armed men were standing outside the British formations in thick smoke. Some regulars could no longer tell friend from enemy. Washington later believed British fire killed some of their own men. The army had come west expecting to destroy an enemy. Now it was losing the ability to identify one. And still, Braddock tried to restore order. The army had come west expecting to destroy an enemy. Now it was losing the ability to identify one. And still, Braddock tried to restore order. Because once Braddock's formations disappeared, so did his ability to command them. Formation was not decoration. It was how an 18th century army moved, how officers transmitted orders, how men knew where they belonged, how hundreds of muskets became one controlled weapon instead of hundreds of frightened men firing individually. So the officers stepped forward. They rode along the lines. They waved swords. They shouted men back toward the colors. And every time one of them made himself visible, someone in the woods had a target. Officers began dropping everywhere. Washington had joined Braddock, hoping to learn from Britain's professionals. Now he was watching those professionals disappear around him. Braddock's aides were hit. Washington began carrying orders through the chaos. One horse was shot beneath him. He found another. That horse went down too. Later, Washington wrote that 4 bullets had passed through his coat without touching him. It became one of the most famous stories of his early life. But at the time, Washington had very little opportunity to think about how lucky he was, because the army around him was still coming apart, and Braddock was still trying to save it. He stayed on the field. He rode through the fire. He tried again and again to gather his men into something he could control. But now the campaign had created one final cruel problem. Remember the road that had taken weeks to build, the road wide enough for guns, the road that had allowed Braddock to drag the British army through the mountains. Now it was full of frightened infantrymen, wounded officers, wagons, artillery, horses, and smoke. There was nowhere else to go. Every attempt to rebuild the formation packed more men into the same space. The road that had made the invasion possible was now helping trap the army on itself. Then Braddock was hit. A musket ball struck him and drove into his chest. The road that had made the invasion possible was now helping trap the army on itself. Then Braddock was hit. A musket ball struck him and drove into his chest. Equipment that had taken weeks to drag through the mountains was thrown away in minutes. Men ran back toward the river. Of roughly 1,400 men in Braddock's advance force, more than 900 were killed or wounded. The fort was still standing. The guns never reached it. And the professional army George Washington had come west to admire was running for its life. Braddock survived for 4 days. His men carried him back along the road while the French remained at Fort Duquesne. Then, Near Great Meadows, the general died. His officers had one final problem. They did not want the enemy to find his body, so they dug a grave, not beside the road, in it. They placed Edward Braddock beneath the same road his soldiers had spent weeks building toward Fort Duquesne, covered him with earth, then marched the surviving army over the top. Men crossed first, then horses, then wagons. By the time they were gone, there was almost nothing left to show where the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America had been buried. The road had been built to carry Braddock to victory. Instead, it carried his army away from defeat, and then it became his grave. For George Washington, the campaign ended very differently. A year earlier, he had returned from Fort Necessity humiliated. This time, people were talking about the young officer who had survived while men fell all around him. 2 horses shot beneath him, 4 holes through his coat. Still alive, still carrying orders, Virginia soon gave Washington command of its frontier forces. His reputation had changed, but one thing had not. He still did not have the British commission he wanted. Washington would continue trying to gain professional recognition from the British military establishment. Britain never truly gave it to him, and that may be the strangest part of the whole story. Washington had joined Braddock because he wanted to learn what made a professional British army powerful. He certainly saw that. The discipline, the artillery, the organization, the enormous logistical machine required to move thousands of men through hostile country. But on July 9th, he saw something else. He saw what happened when that machine lost control. He saw an army win the opening exchange and still lose the battle. He saw officers continue fighting bravely and still lose their army. He saw guns that were terrifying on paper become useless when they could not be moved. And he saw a commander hold on to one position for so long that eventually there was nothing left to command. 20 years later, George Washington would face British armies again and again. To some people, that looked like weakness, but Washington understood something that Braddock's road had made brutally clear. A city could be lost. A road could be lost. A battlefield could be lost. An army could not. The Battle of the Monongahela did not teach Washington how to win the American Revolution. No single afternoon did. But it gave him something much harder to acquire. A front row seat inside the British Army. At the exact moment it stopped functioning. No single afternoon did. But it gave him something much harder to acquire. A front row seat inside the British Army. At the exact moment it stopped functioning. George Washington was no longer asking to join them. He was commanding the army they had to defeat.